Dear listeners, a new day and a new story to discuss. Today I'm going to tell you a story that interests me. Listen and write down what you think about this situation. I'm interested in your opinions. If you're reading this, you're probably trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Well, let me take you back to the start, to the simpler times, before the cracks showed and the walls came tumbling down. My name is Samuel Green. You might think you know my story, but trust me, you don't know the half of it. I met Eleanor at university. She was brilliant, a beam of light in the rather mundane environment of economics lectures and dreary late-night study sessions. "Sam, you think too much," she'd laugh, brushing her hand against mine, those bright eyes locking onto mine like I was the only person in the room. That's how it started, us against the world. Or so I thought. Fast forward 10 years, yes, a whole decade, of what I'd call matrimonial bliss, dulled only by the everyday. 2 daughters, a house that felt like a home, and a life neatly laid out ahead of us. That was the picture. Perfect, right? But pictures lie. And so did Eleanor. "I got a job, Sam. It's at the research facility. Isn't that great?" Her eyes sparkled with the news, not too different from that day in the library when I knew she was the one. But behind that sparkle, there was something else. A flicker of something I couldn't quite catch. That night we went out to celebrate. A local club, just a few drinks, some dancing. Harmless fun. Eleanor in that green dress, clinging and swaying to her curves as she moved. She looked radiant. Magnetic. It's funny, isn't it? How the same qualities that draw you to someone can be the very things that push you away. Jason Hart, the town's golden boy and a pro athlete, was there too. Big guy, full of charm. The kind that fills a room. He came over, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "May I have this dance?" he asked, loud enough for the table but looking only at her. The nerve. She didn't even look at me, not for my approval, not for my consent. Just rose, like a marionette pulled by strings. They danced, and everyone watched. They didn't see me, but I saw them. Her laughter, her hand resting a bit too comfortably on his shoulder. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent, just like that. I tried to cut in, a feeble attempt to mark my territory, perhaps. "May I cut in?" I asked, my voice steady, but my heart hammering against my ribcage. Jason looked at me, almost through me, with a smirk. "Next one's yours, buddy," he said and turned away. The music drowned out the crack of my breaking heart. The night spiraled after that. A slow dance, her head against his chest. I watched, frozen by a mix of rage and disbelief. Then she was gone. They left together. The door swung shut on our life together, just like that. No backward glances, no second thoughts. I went home alone, the house dark and empty, echoing with the ghosts of our past laughter. I sat in the dark, the silence suffocating, plotting my next move. This wasn't just a dance, it was a declaration. One I couldn't ignore. By morning, the plan was clear. If Eleanor thought she could make a fool of me, she was sorely mistaken. I'm not a violent man, but I am a calculating one. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold. And believe me, my plans were icy. So, dear reader, settle in. This is just the beginning. And I promise you, it's going to be a ride you won't forget. You know that feeling, when the floor seems to slip away beneath your feet? That was me, every waking moment after that night. My mind raced, my thoughts a jumble of betrayal and cold fury. The truth is, I had seen signs, ignored them because they were inconvenient. Not anymore. It was a Tuesday morning, barely light out, and the remnants of last night's disaster still hung heavy in the air. I remember making coffee, the sound unusually loud in the silent kitchen. Eleanor walked in, her steps hesitant. She looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since that night. Her eyes were searching, maybe for guilt, maybe for forgiveness. I don't know. Sam, we need to talk, she said, her voice soft, too soft. It was the tone she used when she wanted something. Not this time, I thought. I kept my back to her, pouring the coffee. About what, Eleanor? How you disappeared into the night with him. My voice was calm, too calm. I could feel her stiffen, the air thick with unsaid things. It wasn't like that, Sam. It was just a dance. She reached out, touching my arm. I pulled away, not wanting to feel the warmth of her skin. Not anymore. Just a dance? I laughed, short and sharp. You think I'm a fool, Eleanor? That I didn't see the way you looked at him? That's not just a dance. She flinched, her facade cracking. Sam, please, let me explain. What's there to explain? I cut her off, my heart pounding against my ribs, a mix of anger and something else, something darker. I saw you, Eleanor. You chose him, in front of everyone. What's left to say? There was silence, heavy and uncomfortable. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'm sorry, Sam. I didn't think. That's right, you didn't think. Not about us, not about our daughters. My voice rose, each word sharp and accusing. The coffee cup in my hand trembled slightly. You thought about yourself. That's who you are. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. It's not just about that night. It's been hard, feeling like we're just going through the motions. Going through the motions? I threw the words back at her like a slap. Is that what our life is to you? Just motions? My hands clenched at my sides. The urge to shake her to reality was overwhelming. Yes, sometimes it feels like that. She shouted back, her own anger rising. Maybe I wanted to feel something else, something more. More. The word echoed between us, loaded with years of shared life, shared lies. And what cost, Eleanor? What cost? She didn't answer, just shook her head and looked away. That look, that damned look, said it all. There was no going back, not after this. I left her there, in the kitchen, with her tears and regrets. I had to get out, to breathe, to think. How could I have been so blind? But no, that was the wrong question. The right question was, what was I going to do about it? Revenge, a voice whispered in my head, sweet and seductive. Yes, revenge. That would be the price of her betrayal. And I, Samuel Green, would collect it in full. No more Mr. Nice Guy. That part of me was as dead as the trust she had shattered. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky just turning pink with dawn. A new day, a new beginning, or perhaps an end. Whatever it was, I was ready. Ready to make her regret the day she chose to dance away from us. From me. You think you know the depths of someone's betrayal until it stares you right in the face, glaring, undeniable. That night, the night of revelations, was when the veil was completely pulled back. Let me walk you through it, every cold, hard moment. It was late, maybe around midnight when I decided to follow her. I told myself it was to confirm my suspicions, to see the truth for myself. But deep down, I knew. I knew, and I wanted her to know that I knew. I found them at the club, as expected. The music was a pounding pulse in the background, lights flashing like the chaotic beat of my heart. There she was, dancing close with Jason, too close. Their laughter mingled with the thumping bass, piercing me each time it reached my ears. I approached, my steps measured, my heart a controlled drum of icy resolve. Having fun? My voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. Eleanor turned, her expression flickering from surprise to something darker, maybe guilt, maybe fear.
Sam.
What are you doing here? Just came to see how the evening was going, I said, my tone light, mocking almost. Jason looked between us, a smirk forming on his lips as if he was in on some joke I wasn't privy to. This is a private party, man, Jason interjected, his arm possessively around Eleanor's waist. Maybe you should head home. Private party. His words echoed, a trigger snapping tight in my mind. Oh, I intend to, but not alone. My eyes locked on Eleanor's, letting the full weight of my words sink in. Her face paled, and she stepped back. Sam, I think we should talk. Just you and me. Talk? I laughed, a bitter, hard sound. What's left to talk about, Eleanor? Or should I say, what's left to lie about? It's not what you think, she pleaded, her voice desperate, reaching for something, anything, to salvage the wreck. Please, let's just go home and discuss this. But the night had other plans. As if on cue, the club's doors burst open. Police. 2 officers, their faces set, determined. They scanned the room, their eyes settling on our little trio. Eleanor Green, one called out, moving toward us. Her face went from white to ghostly. Yes? Her voice was barely a whisper. We need you to come with us, ma'am. There's been an incident at your residence. Incident? My mind reeled, then steadied. No, this was not part of my plan. What kind of incident? My voice was a demand, sharp and needing answers. It's best we talk about this at the station, sir, the officer said, a hand on Eleanor's elbow guiding her away. Jason stood there, smirking still, as if untouched by the chaos. Looks like your house is the real party tonight, huh? The club's noise, the flashing lights, Jason's sneer. It all faded into a backdrop as I watched Eleanor being led away, her face a mask of shock and fear. Had she really been so naive? Or was it me, thinking I could control this game of revenge? I followed them, the police car's lights a blur in the night. At the station, the truth unfolded, stark and more brutal than any confrontation at the club could have been. A break-in at my house, our personal space violated, our lives upturned. They questioned her, about enemies, about us. I watched from the other side of that glass, the reality of my own making closing in. What had I unleashed? Was this pursuit of revenge worth the cost? As I sat there, listening to her sobs through the sterile walls of the police station, I realized something. I wasn't just unraveling her life. I was unraveling mine, our daughters, everyone's. And there, in the dim light of the interrogation room, I knew. There was no turning back from this.
No redemption.
No clean slates. Just the debris of shattered lives, and somewhere beneath it all, the truth that would either set us free or bind us forever in its dark, unyielding grip. It's funny how the world doesn't stop, even when your entire life feels like it's crumbling into dust. The sun still rises. The newspaper still lands with a thud on the doorstep, indifferent to your despair. That morning, the morning after the police station, was just another dawn, except my house felt colder, emptier, as if the shadows had seeped into the walls. You know the worst part? The silence. The kind that screams, echoing around you, bouncing off the walls with all the things you didn't say, should have said, or wish you hadn't. I sat at the kitchen table, the chair across from me empty, Eleanor's usual spot. The police had let her go after a few hours, but she didn't come home. Her parents' house, probably. Safer there, away from me. I kept replaying the night before, over and over. How had it come to this? Was it just about revenge, or was there something more, something deeper I hadn't admitted even to myself? I poured a coffee, black, no sugar. The bitterness matched my mood. The front door clicked open. Footsteps. I braced myself, expecting Eleanor, ready to unleash a tirade or to beg forgiveness. I wasn't sure which would be worse. But it wasn't her. It was Detective Moran, badge gleaming, his face a grim mask of duty. "Mr. Green, we need to talk?" His voice was formal, detached. My stomach tightened. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "In my kitchen?" I asked, gesturing to the seat Eleanor had vacated not 24 hours before. He nodded, sitting down heavily. The chair groaned under his weight, a stark reminder that nothing was the same. "There was an incident last night," he started, and I almost laughed. Incident. Such a clinical word for the chaos unleashed. "I know, detective. My wife was there. I was at the station, remember?" He shook his head, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Not that, Mr. Green. Another one. Related." My heart skipped. Related? My mind raced through possibilities, each more disastrous than the last. "It seems that Jason Hart was found dead this morning. At his home." The room spun slightly. Dead? Jason? But how? Why? I struggled to keep my face neutral, to suppress the shock, the flicker of fear, or was it satisfaction? It was hard to tell. Dead. My voice cracked slightly, and I cursed myself for it. How? We're still determining the circumstances. But given your recent interactions with Mr. Hart, we need to ask you some questions. Questions that could imply accusations. The detective's eyes were sharp, probing. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, every reaction, every flicker of emotion potentially incriminating. "I haven't seen him since last night at the club," I said, my voice steady now. "I came home, then went to the station to see my wife." "You can check the surveillance." "We will, Mr. Green. We will check everything." His tone was neutral, but it wasn't comforting. It was a reminder that the ground beneath me was thin ice, cracking under the weight of last night's decisions. After he left, the house felt even emptier, colder. I tried to make sense of it all. Jason dead, Eleanor gone. My world turned upside down. And for what? Because I couldn't handle a dance? The irony of it all was bitter, choking. Had I pushed her to it? Was this my fault?
No.
It couldn't be. This was on Eleanor, on her choices. But Jason's death, that was something else, something dark and twisted that had spun out of my control. I sat there, in the silence of the kitchen, the detective's words echoing in my head. "We will check everything." What would they find? What had I set in motion with my quest for vengeance? As the light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, I realized that this was just the beginning. The fallout was far from over, and I was right at the heart of it. Not just a spectator, but a participant, whether I liked it or not. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, a thought whispered, dark and unwelcome. Was I ready for what would come next? Whatever the answer, the die was cast, and there was no turning back. There are moments in your life when everything you thought you knew about yourself is tested. This was my moment. The walls of our house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now bore down on me with a suffocating weight. Each room echoed with the ghost of Eleanor's absence and the shadow of what I had become. I found myself wandering through the house at odd hours, restless, unable to escape the relentless churn of my thoughts. What had I done? I had wanted to expose her, to confront her betrayal, but now Jason Hart was dead. How had my desire for retribution spiraled so far out of control? The phone rang. It cut through the silence like a siren, jarring against the stillness of the afternoon. I hesitated before answering. "Samuel Green," I managed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Mr. Green, this is Detective Moran. We need you to come down to the station. There have been developments in the investigation." Developments. The word hung heavy. I agreed without asking questions. What was the point? The truth would reveal itself soon enough. The drive to the station was a blur. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was anything but calm. The detective's office was stark, the fluorescent lights harsh against the dull gray of the walls. "Sit down, Mr. Green. There's something you should know," Moran began, his tone somber. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were photos of the crime scene. Jason Hart's lifeless body, his home turned into a tableau of violence. I flinched, recoiling from the images as if they could burn me. "Based on the evidence and your recent interactions with the victim, you're a person of interest." A person of interest. The words echoed in my mind, a label that seemed to brand itself into my consciousness. Was this who I had become? A man capable of driving others to their breaking point, perhaps even to murder? "We have witnesses who saw you at the club that night, and your movements afterward are unclear. Can anyone vouch for your whereabouts the entire night?" Moran's eyes were piercing, searching for cracks in my facade. "I was home," I said, the lie bitter on my tongue. "After I left the station, I went straight home." Moran leaned back, his gaze never leaving mine. "We'll need to verify that. In the meantime, I have to ask, why? Why would you push so hard? What did you hope to gain?" The questions were like punches, each one landing with precision. What had I hoped to gain? Redemption? Satisfaction? I had wanted to make her feel a fraction of the pain I had felt, but nothing felt satisfying about this. Nothing felt redemptive. It felt hollow, empty. "I don't know," I admitted, the words barely a whisper. It was the most honest thing I had said in a long time. I didn't know anymore. What began as a quest for truth had degenerated into a maelstrom of anger and vengeance, leaving destruction in its wake. Moran nodded, his expression unreadable. "You can go home, Mr. Green. But this isn't over. We'll be in touch." Home. The word seemed ironic now. What was home without Eleanor, without trust, without peace? I left the station, the weight of the detective's gaze heavy on my shoulders. As I drove, the city lights blurred past, indistinct and unremarkable. At home, I stood at the threshold, the door opened before me. This house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Each step was heavier than the last as I walked through the door. The breakdown wasn't loud or violent. It was silent, a slow crumbling of everything I had believed about myself. As I sat in the dark, waiting for a dawn that seemed as if it might never come, I finally understood the true cost of vengeance. It was not measured in the pain inflicted on others, but in the destruction of the self. In seeking to punish Eleanor, I had dismantled my own life. The truth, when it came, would not change that. No matter how this ended, the wreckage of my own making was all that would remain. There's an eerie silence that settles over you after the storm has passed, when the debris is all that remains of what was once your life. As I sat in the muted light of dawn, the events of the past few days seemed like fragments of a nightmare, yet they were all too real. The house was silent, the kind of oppressive quiet that suffocates. I couldn't stay there, not with every corner, every shadow reminding me of Eleanor and the cascading consequences of my actions. "I thought you might come." The voice came from behind me as I stood at Jason Hart's grave. It was Eleanor. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. I turned, taking in her appearance. She looked worn, her eyes hollow with grief and something else, perhaps guilt, perhaps resignation. "Why are you here, Eleanor?" "To understand why," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the fresh mound of earth that marked Jason's final resting place. "Why did it have to come to this?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman I had married, the woman I had vowed to love and protect. What had I become in my quest to expose her betrayal? Had it been worth it? "We lost ourselves, Eleanor," I said, the words tasting bitter. "I lost myself in my anger and desire for revenge. I thought I was seeking justice." "Justice?" She scoffed lightly, a sad smile playing on her lips. Is this justice, Samuel? He's gone, and we're broken. What justice is there in that? I had no answer. The silence stretched between us, a gulf filled with regret and lost chances. Eleanor took a step closer, her hand reaching out as if to bridge the gap, then withdrawing. What now, Samuel? Where do we go from here? I shook my head, the weight of my choices heavy on my shoulders. I don't know, Eleanor. I truly don't know. We stood there, two figures shadowed by grief and betrayal, at the grave of the man whose death had marked the irrevocable breakdown of our lives. The police had cleared me eventually, no evidence to hold me, but the damage was done. The community's whispers, the sidelong glances, they were all scars on my conscience and on our lives. Will you come back home? I asked finally, the question hanging in the air, fragile as glass. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something perhaps long lost. I don't know if I can, Samuel. Too much has happened. There's too much pain. And there it was, the truth laid bare between us. We were strangers bound by shared history, a history marred by betrayal and darkened by loss.
I'm sorry, Eleanor.
For everything, I said, the words inadequate to express the depth of my remorse. Me too, she replied, her voice a mere whisper carried away by the wind. She turned then, walking away slowly, her figure receding into the distance, leaving me by the grave, alone. I watched her go, each step a punctuation mark in the final chapter of our story. As I turned back to face the grave, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, I understood that some wounds are too deep to heal, some fractures too wide to bridge. Redemption was a distant, unattainable shore, and I was adrift, lost in the aftermath of my own wrath. The aftermath wasn't just the ending of our marriage, or the tragedy that unfolded. It was the lingering realization of what I had lost in my pursuit of retribution. The price of vengeance was steep, paid not in the currency of satisfaction, but in the coin of soul-deep sorrow. In the quiet of that dawn, as the world slowly awoke around me, I knew that moving forward wasn't about forgetting, but about living with the knowledge of what I had done and finding some way, any way, to continue.